So welcome everyone. Welcome to the 197th CPR-CSH workshop. We have the pleasure today to welcome Christian Schmidt. Christian Schmidt is a professor of sociology at the Department of Architecture in Zurich. Thank you, Christian, for participating in this seminar. So I will just discuss the rule. I mean, we don't have much rules here, but it's a 45 minutes talk followed by a round of questions that can last sometime long. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, then, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here and to share our experiences and our reflections with you. It's my first time in Delhi. It's not my first time in India, but my first time in Delhi. And it's a very impressive city and a very I would say a very extensive city too. And so you will just see what I mean with that in my talk. So the title of my talk is Planetary Urbanization in Comparative Perspective. So I will have to explain, of course, certain elements of what is planetary urbanization. I will give you examples of how we make comparative analysis. I mean, my talk is probably a bit long, so maybe at a certain moment I stop and then maybe I could also add some elements during the discussion. Now, starting with planetary urbanization is, I think, at the moment quite a controversial topic. There are quite some responses to the papers and chapters that we have published in the last years. So I will not go into the debate now of the critiques. I think I will just try to show you how we understand this concept of planetary urbanization and especially how we apply it. The point is that very often the critiques are about a certain understanding. Okay, you have a certain idea what planetary urbanization is or what it could be, but in fact, I mean, we developed that concept, and if I say we, this is Neil Brenner and I working together on this concept, and so we had certain definitions, but we had also certain applications in mind, because this doesn't come out of a pure theoretical reflection, but it comes out of quite a lot of empirical research that we have done earlier and that we still do and that we also will do in the future. Now, maybe a little bit astonishing, so I start with the postcolonial turn. I don't think I have to present the postcolonial turn here, but I think a major point, a major starting point of that turn was to take a different perspective on the world. Of course, the critique of the dominance of Western concepts, or maybe more precisely of Anglo-American concepts, this is one thing, but I think it's much more important also to understand that it is a kind of a new perspective that says, and here, of course, I quote Jennifer Robinson and her kind of programmatic title, Ordinary City. So every city on that planet could become the starting point of a reflection on urbanization and on the urban. And I think that is what we take from the post-colonial turn. So not to privilege certain places or certain cities that are well understood and well researched since decades, but to somehow accept every place, so in the post-colonial turn first, every city as a starting point of reflections. Now, if now we add something to that, we could say, okay, planetary urbanization, and I will show that just in a minute, comes from a range of observations, is a concept that starts with some reflections written by Henri Lefebvre. You find this idea of the planetary already in his writings on the city. You find it already in the le droit à la ville, the right to the city. There's already the planetary, or in the urban revolution also, there's already some reflections about the planetary, but the concept of planetary urbanization, actually, he only developed very late in his life, almost in the last year, where he wrote an article in the Monde Diplomatique. It is something like a kind of a legacy of his theory and of his famous thesis of the complete urbanization of society. Now, but that was just a starting point, and so Neil Brenner and I, we started to reflect about recent trends in urbanization somewhere in the well, around 2008, 2009, and started then to develop that concept somehow in pace with Andy Murrayfield, who also is the same. What happened here? Okay, so we did that somehow in pace with Andy Murrayfield, who at the same time also kind of referred to Henri Lefebvre's. So Andy Murrayfield, who somehow in a similar kind of way developed also his understanding of planetary urbanization. I don't want to go into details here and differences. This is not important. I think what is important is, so what does it mean, planetary urbanization? It means that somehow urbanization got a kind of planetary reach. So you could say that in one way or another, each, let's say, place on that planet is somehow affected by urbanization processes. So that's kind of a first statement. That does not mean that every place on that Earth becomes a kind of a major city. No, that's not the point. The point is that these places are affected by urbanization processes, and I will just explain what we mean with that. And then, as a consequence, to say we have to take a planetary perspective if you want to understand what's going on here in the field of urbanization. And urbanization is not everything, and is not all of life on Earth. And that means, at the end, a kind of a decentering of the analytical perspective. So following this idea of ordinary city and saying every city can become a starting point of reflections on urbanization, we could say every point on that Earth could become a starting point on the reflection on urbanization. So not only every, what we call city, but also some other places. We could position ourselves somewhere in an eccentric position and look on what happens and how urbanization unfolds. Now, that was somehow starting, I mean, we were somehow inspired by a whole range of phenomena. I go now very quickly through those phenomena, and just to show you that this is not something that just comes from kind of a theoretical reflection, but it comes in a trial to really find concepts and find terms to grasp with the contemporary urbanization processes. So the first one is that, and I think that is that's well known. So there are new scales of the urban or of urbanization emerging. All the debates about agglomerations and then metropolitan regions, and at the end we are now arriving at concepts of mega regions. So, I mean, I don't go into the details here, but this is just a map published by the Regional Plan Association for the United States, and you see that they identify a whole range of really huge regions that they call are the new kind of mega regions that we should look at. I don't explain that now, and I mean, I don't agree with all this, with all the details about that, but it's just to show that there are quite a range of debates going on about the urban and urbanization that goes far beyond what was seen until today as a kind of agglomeration or metropolitan region. We see the Northeast, we see, of course, Northern and Southern California, the Great Lakes, that's well known, but then some regions that are seen as peripheral regions, like the Piedmont Atlantic or the Texas Triangle or the Front Range, whatever that is. But you see that even in this Regional Plan Association of the US, they identified a kind of new forms that of the urban. A second point is what we call the disintegration of contiguous hinterlands. So this idea, we have a center and then we have a hinterland, and the hinterland is serving the center. That's in that sense not true anymore, because the hinterland becomes much more complex. And that's just one example. That's a project that my colleague from ETH, Milica Topalovic, has on the Singapore hinterlands in the plural. So Singapore, this, I guess you know well, this kind of city-state, an island that is not very large, with 5 million people living on that island, and then a whole debate about this city. But if you have a closer look, you suddenly realize that this region is much bigger. So first of all, here you see the Singapore Straits with all the ships. So the most congested kind of motorway for ships in the world. And so we could say this is a kind of urbanized sea, kind of urbanization of the sea. If we go to the islands, if you go to the islands in the south, here on Batam, I've just been there some days ago. Then you see huge industrial developments. It's one of the biggest shipyard, beneath other things, one of the biggest shipyard in the world. And if you go one step further, we see here Fantasy Island, a kind of gated community for wealthy tourists, just next door here to a traditional kampung that is still, and we work precisely on this kampung, and I mean these are worlds that are kind of clashing together. You are in that kampung, and there are kind of well, it is like this village life still in a very good sense. And then you see to this tourist resort, and then you see a kind of oil racks that are produced in the shipyard, and then in the horizon you see the skyline of Singapore. So a kind of coming together of really a juxtaposition of all sorts of elements that are kind of almost impossible. So if you look, so this kind of hinterland somehow explodes, and we find, I mean, if you go further and think about where is the food coming from that is consumed in Singapore, where is the water coming from, where is the sand coming from for the landfills, where is the labor power coming from, then suddenly you realize, well, that's at the end, it's almost the whole planet that becomes a kind of the hinterland of Singapore. And Singapore is just such a good example because you can isolate it, because it's a state in itself. But the same is true for New York, I think for Delhi, it's true for all the big cities that they have a kind of, not one hinterland, but a whole range of hinterlands that are serving somehow these centralities. Next point, and that is directly related, operationalization of landscapes. So these huge, let's say, mines. So the sites of raw material production. That's an example at the Atacama Desert, at the edge at the Kama Desert. Great paper by Martin Arboleda about these expanded infrastructural networks that are behind one of the huge copper mines in that area. Another example. This is now India. I bring that film. It's a film Millions Can Walk. It's a film that is actually produced in Switzerland about this huge march that was organized of the, well, we could call it the indigenous people, in India, that were somehow that lost their lands, that were relocated, that were deprived of their land as a result of land grab. And the film just shows that huge march and the organization of that march and how it stopped then some 100 kilometers before Delhi. But what the film doesn't really show, but what is behind that film, and I can tell that because Christoph Schaub is an old friend of mine. So he explained me when I asked him what is behind the kind of the problem of people that are losing their land and that are somehow relocated and expelled from their land. And then it came out that behind that, I mean, classically these are maybe huge dam projects or huge again, mining projects, but more and more these are also kind of huge wastelands, dump sites, huge, more and more mining, so raw material production of all sorts that lead to the expropriation of those people from their land. And it is seen usually as a social problem or as a political problem. It is rarely debated as a problem of urbanization. And we could say that this is a manifestation against the consequences of forced and more and more intense forms of urbanization. So just as an example, I mean, I'm sure we will debate that later. Of course, I'm not fully familiar with the problematic, and I'm really interested to get your responses to that. Other kind of effects or phenomena that we found is the implosion, explosion of urban regions. So that regions somehow get new centralities and produce new peripheries. This is just one of the examples. I will not explain the details. This is Lagos. And I mean, resulting in kind of situations like this, where suddenly, I mean, implosion, new centralities, but an explosion, and this kind of territories, they kind of expand further and further. The production of extended urban fabrics of logistics. Here, as an example, a very interesting paper by Jeffrey Wilson, The Plant Traveler Panama. And he, in kind of reference to Henri Lefebvre, the violence of abstract space as a form of violent space. And that was a project to construct a huge, a kind of a highway, but it was not just a highway, it was combined with all sorts of other infrastructural projects from Puebla to Panama. Finally, it failed, but he shows the kind of effects that only the planning of that project had, and of all the resistances against it. I mean, that's now, of course, the big debate. I mean, this kind of belt mania, one road, one belt, well, one belt, one road. And it's not only the Chinese belt, but all sorts of competing belts, somewhere in the debates.
The Chinese, it is just belt and road.
Okay. Just belt and roads, yes. And then the urbanization of the global rural. I mean, the rural will be a long debate. I don't go into details here. We can discuss that later. But just to show that also seemingly really rural areas, for instance, the Nile Valley, show kind of significant forms of urbanization, even if it might not be really successful in the first instance. This is a project we looked at ETH Studio Basel, and on a book we recently published on the specificity of the urban, so that each urban space is specific. But here it was an analysis of the Nile Valley and to see how the Nile Valley somehow, where the people and politics try to somehow escape the limitations of that linear oasis and escape to the desert somehow on the banks of the river. At the moment, not a success, but maybe in the next round, maybe it is. It will lead to a strong urbanization process, linear urbanization process along the river. Finally, the urbanization of wilderness spaces, project that Neil Brenner had with his students at the Urban Theory Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, under the title Extreme Territories of Urbanization. So here just an example of the urbanization of the Arctic. I, of course, don't have time to explain that now. So, resulting of these observations, so Neil Brenner and I then try to think about it. What does it mean? What does these experiences mean for urban theory? And so we didn't start with urban theory, but with the epistemology. So how we understand the world, how we explain the world, how do we explain the urban world? And so we published that paper towards a new epistemology of the urban, with a question mark as a kind of a proposal. And here we really try to somehow, with 7 theses, to explain or to propose a kind of reorientation of our view on the urban and on urbanization. And I mean, that would be a talk in itself to explain that, but I think it's important that we start with the point that urbanization and the urban is a theoretical category. So everybody means the urban is clear what it is. I will just come back to that in a minute. It's not clear. It's a question of the position you have. It's the question of the theory you have on the urban. There are a lot of theories in the history of urban studies, and these theories are usually completely different. And there are very, very different definitions of what the urban is, and the non-urban, of course, too. For us, important, the urban is a process. Of course, it's always a form, but this form is constantly changing, so we should look on the process. This is a moment that Henri Lefebvre really pointed out very strongly. We have to understand the process, a long-term process, and not just look on certain urban forms that change maybe already next year. Concentrated on extended urbanization, I will come to that in a minute. Urbanization is multidimensional. I mean, that's precisely to escape a little bit these one-dimensional contradictory theories, so that you have a multidimensional understanding of what urbanization is. Urbanization has become planetary, of course. That was the starting point. And there are variegated patterns and pathways of urbanization. So with the kind of adding specificity. So we don't say that planetary urbanization means that everything becomes the same. No. It means, on the contrary, that there are very, very different ways how the urban somehow evolves and how urbanization emerges. So it's not the idea at all that everything becomes the same. On the contrary. And finally, as a kind of also political point, here at the end, we could put it on the beginning, of course, the urban is a common project. So the urban as a let's say, a project of emancipation, as a project to control urbanization, as a project to make the best out of the urbanization and to produce a really urban world, that's a common project. That's not the question of what two intellectuals think about it, and that's not a question of even what the academy thinks about it, but it's a question of how people act and react and somehow somehow create an urban world. That's a political project, and it's a common project. It's a collective project at the end. So, urbanization. So, what maybe not many people really know, urbanization is a term that was created in the 1870s, 60s, 70s, by Ildefonso Cerdá, so a Spanish, Catalan architect, and he didn't link it to agglomeration. Very often urbanization is seen as agglomeration, but that was not the original definition. The original definition in Spanish was Urbanisation, and that means just the extension of settlement areas. And behind that was, of course, the experience that at a certain moment in history, with the beginning of industrialization, suddenly a lot of cities started to expand, somehow demolished their walls, that somehow restricted this urban space and defined that urban space and started to expand. And that is, so he called that urbanisation. And so that's a starting point. We could go, of course, through the theory of David Harvey, where urbanization is very strongly linked to the circulation of capital and is also linked to the process of the production of the built environment. And we could then go to Henri Lefebvre. If you apply his theory, his three-dimensional theory, we could understand already urbanization as a three-dimensional process. So first of all, a process of material production that is strongly influenced by spatial practices. Second, kind of a process of the production of knowledge and of regulation, of territorial regulation. So the state plays an important role, but also all sorts of actors that might be in contradiction with the state, and of course landowners and so on. And finally, the production of meaning, and we could say that is strongly linked to lived space, and lived space, of course, comes from everyday life. So here, a kind of understanding to bring together at least these three dimensions of material production, of regulation, of territorial regulation, and of everyday life as kind of key moments of this urbanization process. And now the starting point, concentrated urbanization and extended urbanization. So with planetary urbanization, we don't say that the process of agglomeration doesn't play a role anymore. I mean, the power of agglomeration is a very strong economic and social and cultural power that leads to a whole range of effects, important effects, and leads also to the fact that certain cities grew and grew and grew, and then we had the urban regions and finally the megacities, and today the mega regions. And so this is one way to approach the urban, and that's the map. The 500 agglomerations on the world. It's already from 2008, so there would be some more today. With 1 million inhabitants and more. So that could be one way to approach it. So we analyze 500 agglomerations, and that's it. Or there could be another perspective, and that is this one, saying, okay, we look at the shipping lanes, at the global shipping lanes. And you see this is a totally different understanding of urbanization. And we call that extended urbanization. And it means, so there's concentrated urbanization, the spatial clustering of population, means of production, infrastructure, and investment, versus extended urbanization. And extended urbanization means you can't have concentrated urbanization without an import of all sorts of people, ideas, goods, food, water, and so on and so forth, raw materials. They have to produce somewhere, and this somewhere is always seen as outside of the urban, but in fact it's generated through the urban, and it's linked to the urban with all sorts of connections, with shipping lanes, with motorways, and so on. That means that these places are also changing. We could also look on movements, migration processes, so they are also kind of changed. Migration processes are processes that come from somewhere, go to somewhere, and this does not only mean that the end point of the migration is changed, but also the starting point. There are kind of capital flows that go back to the villages where the migrants are coming from. And today, of course, migration is also not just a point-to-point movement. We have all sorts of circular migrations and very complicated patterns of migration that we call movements. It is just movements in space, and these movements are linking social spaces but also material spaces in various ways. And that is what we mean with extended urbanization. And then there is differential urbanization. So urbanization has the potential to somehow differentiate, where so the famous definition of Henri Lefebvre, an urban space is where the where differences are coming together. That means where the wealth of a society somehow is linked. And if I say wealth, I mean that's first of all the people with their ideas, with their kind of capacities, with their experiences, with their desires. They meet in different ways, and that's the kind of the potential that lies in urbanization. And we find that as well in concentrated forms of urbanization, but also in extended forms of urbanization. Now, so there are already some studies about those processes. So this is, of course, the famous book by edited by Neil Brenner, Implosions, Explosions, where he brought together a whole range of existing texts and some new texts at the time that are engaging with those phenomena. There is another project we did in Switzerland where we analyzed the entirety of the Swiss territory. As everybody knows, Switzerland is full of cows, and so it's often seen as a rural country, and so we shouldn't be we shouldn't believe that. First of all, Switzerland was one of the most industrialized countries in Europe already in the early 19th century, and second, yes, there are cows. Yes, there are cows on the meadows, but these are not rural cows; these are urban cows. So here we try to somehow identify and qualify the different landscapes of Switzerland according to their specific urbanization processes. And one of the success of that was that we managed at the end to analyze Switzerland without using the term rural, but we could identify different urbanization processes in the different parts of Switzerland, even in those mountain regions that usually are seen as the kind of, let's say, the ultimate places of the rural. Another result of the ETH Studio Basel is, well, this is the wrong title here, is a project that was called Territory and is now published, and it is a study of transects of about 200-300 kilometers in all these places, so in Belo Horizonte, in Muscat and Oman, Red River Delta, Florida, a full transect between Rome and the Adriatic, so across the Italian peninsula, and in trying to understand the different forms of urbanization, of concentrated and extended urbanization that are emerging on these territories. So extended urbanization includes movements, so just as one point migration, but migration in a very broad sense. All sorts of movements that somehow create very different urban territories. Extended urbanization is strongly linked with a logistical space that is created through all sorts of course, streets, roads, motorways, airports, shipping lanes, harbors, satellite communications, and that, of course, fosters connections, connectivity, so that as an important element of it. Extended urbanization means also the extension of scales of territorial regulation that involve state strategies in a contradictory kind of interplay with local strategies. Extended urbanization means the intensification of the urban fabric or the urban tissue. So it's not only the fabric, but it's also kind of like a tissue that sometimes covers the surface of the earth. And extended urbanization includes, of course, the various forms of operationalization of landscapes. That refers to social metabolism. So how food is produced today in a highly industrialized way, how huge raw material extraction sites are kind of developed, and all that goes along with that. We, at the moment, make a study at the Future Cities Laboratory Singapore on territories of extended urbanization. That is the reason I just came from Singapore. We just had a meeting and a conference discussing in detail a whole range of such phenomena and developments in different parts of the world. So, now in the remaining time, I would like to shift now to another project that we just finished. It's still not fully finished, but we just published our first, let's say, encompassing article about that project. And this is now also about planetary urbanization, but not about extended urbanization, but about concentrated urbanization. So just to show that it does not mean, if we discuss about planetary urbanization, it does not mean that we only look on operationalized landscapes or that we look on very remote zones. But we can also look on even the biggest, the largest urban regions in that world, but we look with a different perspective. And that project was precisely doing that. That's the team, quite a large team of researchers, of PhD researchers and postdoc researchers. And what we did was analyzing and comparing 8 large metropolitan regions. Now, we just published that. So this is me and the entire team. So actually 8 authors, and it just came out now in Urban Studies. So if you miss something here, you can just read it afterwards. Here, the point was to understand, so what did we compare? So we didn't, you can understand now, we didn't compare cities, because we don't think that cities is something that we still can somehow delineate and delimit. We don't understand cities as something that is kind of a bounded unit, even if we have metropolitan regions that somehow explodes. But what we can do is analyze processes, various processes of urbanization that are shaping these urban territories. And that is what we try to do. At the moment, we have some well-established concepts. The three most widely used concepts are suburbanization, gentrification, informal urbanism, or urban informality, if you like. And there are more specific terms like post-suburbanization or peri-urbanization, ex-urbanization, desakota. So there are already a range, and I could add now a whole range of other terms. So there are at the moment quite some terms that are used to characterize urbanization processes, but still, let's say the 3 at the beginning, these are still the 3 that are most widely used. And in that paper, we give quite a detailed critique of these 3 terms. Now we try to develop these new concepts because we were somehow convinced that these kind of classic concepts of urbanization, and we started with that project 2011, so 7 years ago, So there the debate was not as well advanced as today. So at that time we thought these three terms are really not, don't give us a good instrument at hand to analyze our urban territories, whether the large ones or the let's say the more smaller ones. And we said, okay, we take these 8 large urban territories and we make a comparison. Now there are, of course, a lot of comparative strategies. I refer here again to Jennifer Robinson in her recent paper that she published in Progress in Human Geography. So what does it mean, comparisons? It means, I mean, in urban studies, it means thinking through elsewhere. And there she develops also a very interesting kind of almost epistemological understanding of comparative strategies as genetic comparisons that show how different outcomes are produced, or as generative comparisons, bringing different cases in conversation with each other. And out of that, we can somehow understand that comparison can, I mean, very often comparisons are just used to test, let's say, an existing concept. So let's say you compare different forms of suburbanization or different forms of gentrification, and you make a kind of to show that if let's say the range of possible outcomes and so on. But here, comparison is used as an instrument of theory building. So as itself kind of an epistemological movement that helps to generate theory and, of course, new concepts. Now, how we did that? And I explained that especially because one of the critiques on planetary urbanization is a top-down concept. It just thinks the globe, the world, the Earth, the planet, and forgets about what's going on the ground. Now, with that contribution, I would like to show you that whatever you think about this planetary urbanization, but we work differently with that concept, very differently. So we start from the ground, and that means from very concrete experiences that we study with classical means of you could say ethnographical research, with interviews, with all sorts of field work, and so with qualitative approaches. And here we developed a specific form of, and that was our starting point, a specific form of mapping, where we try to understand, I mean, that was quite a thing to understand, let's say, a huge urban region like Tokyo, or let's say the East Pearl River Delta, or Lagos. And we did that with a specific form of mapping. Maybe in the discussion I can explain more about that. But maybe you see this image here in the middle. So this is another project where we developed that method, actually. This is Havana, where I worked for quite some years, and we still are continuously working on that project. Havana, a place where you didn't have a lot of information about the territory, about urban development, and so the way to find out about the territory was just, and it was an invitation. So I was invited to work together with some of the most experienced planners and architects in Havana, and we didn't have a lot of information. So then I said, okay, so let's start to map. It was a kind of collective mapping process, and it was interesting because I said, okay, you know your territory, you know your place, so let's discuss about your place and just map that. And the results were really stunning. And then we found out that we can use that as a method, so as a starting point to understand certain characteristics of the territory. And it's very simple. I mean, it's not, we start with very simple questions. So one question, usually the first question, what is the center? Where is the center? Where is the center of your city or of your place? And then the usual response is, which center? And then then our reaction is, okay, there are obviously several, so let's discuss about the different centralities that are marking your territory. And out of that, we then go through the whole territory, and these sessions can become, the longest was 3 days. I mean, not in a row, but in several meetings. You can have it collectively, like here, or you can just use it as a kind of, let's say, as a long interview, where the map just helps you to explain the situation. That is then added by, that is only the starting point, the mapping, and that is then added by a mobile and multi-sided research. I can't go into the details of that, but it means that you really cross the territory. So the researcher really cross the territories, the territory with all sorts of, I mean, on foot, by car, and talks with people and tries to understand the different qualities of the territory. And then we, that is now disappeared, that image, but it's not a big problem. In a next step comes the first comparative moment that each researcher makes. You produce a map. A map that we call a map of urban configurations, where you just, to make it very simple, the exercise is, you have the territory, it could be a large one, and you get, let's say, 10 colors. You can use all of the 10, you can have more if you need, you can use less of them, and at the end of that exercise, you have to come with a map that where no white spots are left over, no? And if there are white spots, it means you need some additional research too, to find out what's going on these white spots. And so you just have your colors, and then the question is, okay, what does it mean? And the first exercise is to understand, okay, so this color is blue and the one is green, and what is the difference between why is that blue and why is that green, and what is the difference? So what are the characteristics of these two urban configurations? And then comes the next step, and that is now the comparative moment too, where we compare the different territories. And so we call that the comparative workshops. So intense debates about the differences of our 8 territories. And to give you an example for that, usually these intense debates go on for about 10 days. And we started with our first workshop at the very beginning of the project in 2011. And we made every half a year such a workshop for about 6 years. So if you calculate, at the end, we found out that we discussed during about 3 months, the entire team, including me, to really try to understand these different, so the differences of these territories. And that means that so the comparative moment was really intense debate between the members of the team. A kind of very classic way to develop concepts. What came out of that was were then, of course, a range of maps. At the beginning, it was just a tool. At the end, these maps became a kind of a product. We also then worked together with cartographers, especially Filip Rekačević, you might know, because he was the former cartographer from the Mont Diplomatique, and he was the driving force behind the famous Atlas de Globalisation, the Globalization Atlas, edited by the Mont Diplomatique. And it was a great experience, and we finally made then also an exhibition at the Biennale in Shenzhen 3 years ago. And what came out were such maps. So maybe I come back to them later, but just to show you, so this is, so I just go from east to west. So this is Tokyo, this is Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dongguan. This is Kolkata. This is Istanbul, Lagos, Paris, Mexico City, and Los Angeles. And now, out of these maps, we then developed somehow as the goal, as the aim, so different processes of urbanization. So here we have part of the list of existing processes, and this one that we somehow developed through our comparative method. And to maybe, I don't know how much time is left, but I try to show you now three, we can discuss later. I just make it it's just as a kind of overview what came out of that. And then we can maybe discuss it in more detail if you like. So one process that popped up very early was some process that is linked usually to informality. But what immediately became clear when we compared the examples of our case studies was that informality means a lot of things. And areas that we call informal areas can be very, very different. And so we started with a process very much inspired by Latin America, with a process that we then called popular urbanization. In fact, it comes from the term Urbanisation popular, but so that was used in Mexico, for instance. But it is a process that we then defined in a different way. And it is a process where really people produce their own neighborhoods through strong collaborative ways. So through networks of solidarity, through networks of kinship, through but in a strong collective way, produce houses for themselves. That is the key moment. And that's so one example is Mexico City. Half of the houses in Mexico City are self-constructed, so that's something that really happens, so that people construct their own houses by themselves, with their own hands. Areas that at the beginning look like slums, everything is missing, and by all sorts of collective struggles and organizations, they reach that these neighborhoods get all sorts of at the beginning it's just nothing, just some houses, and then it gets electricity and water and finally the streets are paved and so on. And you see here this can become quite nice neighborhoods, quite flexible neighborhoods where you can add also a floor if necessary, where you can install a shop or a workshop. And so a neighborhood that is also something that, for instance, this is now one example is Nessa Huyacoyotl, so they just call it Nessa, a neighborhood with about 2 million inhabitants, where about 1/4 of the people even work in their neighborhood. So something that really evolved to a quite interesting and quite lively and I would say also really great type of neighborhood, constructed through the engagement of the inhabitants. Another example is the famous Gecekondu neighborhoods in Istanbul. There, and I will just come back to that in a moment, this was the main process of the production of houses for the people for about 3 decades. So starting in the 1950s, going up to the 1980s, this was the way how the immense growth of Istanbul was somehow produced on the ground through this kind of Gecekondu development. I mean, the same is true for Mexico. These huge mega cities, they finally basically developed through this kind of process. This is Lagos, and in Lagos, it's interesting enough that the process is only a marginal process. So you find that this is one of the famous kind of slum areas, We don't use the term slum for many reasons. But that's always kind of the iconographic image for Lagos on this water. Famous motorway goes just along that, and so a lot of people see that. But in fact, this is a marginal phenomenon in Lagos for many reasons. But here, the idea behind popular urbanization is to have a positive term, no? To say it is possible that people construct their own neighborhoods in a good way. And to say informal urban informality, this is always a kind of like a deviation. No? The basic process would be formalized. Informal is, even if you redefine it, and we engaged very strongly also with, of course, the contributions by Ananya Roy and Al Sayad and so on, about a redefinition of informality. But however you do it, we propose here a process that is kind of more focused, and we say, okay, these are neighborhoods that are produced by the people as a kind of positive moment. It is possible to construct your own neighborhood through collective engagements. Now, a second process that is also a process where informality plays a key role, and now you see why we try to make it more precise and to find new titles, new terms, is plotting urbanism. And plotting is a process that brings together places that are at first sight very different. So this is Kolkata, this is Lagos, this is Shenzhen, and this is Istanbul. Now, plotting means a process that goes on plot by plot. So maybe I start with Lagos. So if you look, the large parts of Lagos is somehow produced like that. So it starts with a plot. So you have to get a plot of land, and on that land you construct a house, not by yourself, but by you hire, of course, people who construct your house. And it starts already with that very first moment to construct a house, because how you get the land. And now I can't go into the details, but the point in Lagos and in many other places is that you can't just buy a piece of land. There is a formal, in Lagos it's really a kind of double land regime. You have a formal, so you have to buy a land according to the formal rules of buying a piece of land, but at the same time there are kind of traditional claims on the land, and this is not so clear how you get the right to use that land. The land is owned by old families, and it's a very complex process, and it can be that you think you bought a piece of land and suddenly somebody comes and says, I'm a part of that family, I didn't get kind of money for that, so you have to pay again. So a very complex kind of overlapping of rules that are never clearly decided. And in that situation, so you are in a kind of in-between situation, and you start without a full kind of security. You buy a first house. Usually these houses are bigger than what you need. They are called I face you, you face me houses. So kind of house where you have about 5 rooms that are, so 10 rooms, so in 2 rows, so five rooms that are always opposite, so they face each other. And then you can rent out. You can rent out these rooms, and then maybe you construct the second floor and the third floor. And now you see here a fundamental difference to the process of popular urbanization. So so people here they construct the house for themselves and their family first, but immediately also to rent it out. So we have immediately a process of rent in it, no? So we have a market. You produce for a market, and this allows people to get cheap houses, but at the same time, it is a very strange mixture of landlords, house owners, and people who rent an apartment or a room that are living just next door to each other. And in that process, the land, of course, the plot owner, if you like, is of course relatively free what to do. The legislation is almost not given. So at a certain moment, it might be that you decide to completely demolish the house. People have to live somewhere else, and you construct a bigger house. Or at the end, you could even construct a villa, a fully gated villa, if you are becoming rich. So this is a process that is unpredictable, and the entirety of Lagos, I would say about 80% of Lagos is constructed like that, and it's a process that can be extremely fast. So that is very often completely underestimated, that this process can be very, very fast, because if thousands of plot owners decide that they want now to construct a new house or extend their house, you can imagine that this is completely decentralized, and that can be a very, very fast process. Now, I link it now to the most spectacular example, Shenzhen. As everybody knows, this is a new town, started with a decision by Deng Xiaoping in 1979 to, first of all, a new economic policy, and second, a special economic zone that is docking to Hong Kong. So to become the first let's say, global city development of the Republic of China. And everybody, of course, thinks, yes, this is a new town, fantastic. Today there are 15 million, nobody knows. I say 15 millions, it could be more. People that came in as migrant, most of them came in as migrant laborers from other regions, even speaking a different language. So they speak Mandarin, and in the region you speak Cantonese. And then the idea is this was a top-down process, but this is not the story. This is not the full story. There is a top-down process. Centralities were planned top-down, but these houses, these are the classical houses for migrant laborers. They were constructed by the villages, and I can't explain the details here, but there is a very contradictory relationship between the state, and this is not the central state, but this is usually the regional state. So in that case, the city-state, the city of Shenzhen, that was in a very complex process with the villages, somehow negotiated, and somehow just through, let's say, violating the laws. So the villages sometimes just started to. So the city tried to take away the land from the villages, and the villages then, of course, defended their land and did that in just constructing new houses for immigrant people, and so in that very turbulent process, they in fact produced a large part of the new city of Shenzhen. So again, a kind of complex relationship. Is unclear about how the land is, what is the access to the land, what is the land rules, a kind of overlapping, contradictory negotiations, and in that process, each village decided, now we construct a house, we construct not one house, but many houses, and higher. At the end now, you don't see much of these urban villages anymore in the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, because now, today, I mean, in that process, the villages became, they started to have companies, land, so the companies now owned the land, and then finally, now it is a much more regularized process, and most of these houses are now demolished, and new condo towers and office buildings are constructed. But the basis of that was this very complex process of, again, plotting, so somehow plot by plot, decisions that were quite random, but at the end led to the construction of the biggest new town in the world. The case of Istanbul shows how a process of popular urbanization can turn. So for a long time, these Gece condo areas were really meant for the family. At a certain moment, through a whole range of negotiations and amnesties, this kind of land ownership became regulated and normalized, and stabilized. And in that moment, the plot owner started to construct higher, to rent out apartments, and now it's a much more commodified process. And so here, so the commodification enters the game. It's not just producing neighborhoods for yourself, but for a market, and so it's a different process. And here, the last example of Kolkata, this is in Howrah, a huge area that was that originally was, and you still see those houses at here at the beginning. These are Bastille areas. I can't go into the details here, but that were these one-floor buildings, and then suddenly a kind of massive densification through complex processes where these kind of concrete structures with 4 or 5 stories emerged and created a quite difficult situation here in Kolkata. And it was really while we made our research that this happened. So suddenly, from let's say 2 years later, so I was there at one moment, and 2 years later, the whole neighborhood almost changed here. Okay, so that's, maybe I stop here. I mean, I could continue with bypass urbanism. Maybe in the discussion I can explain that more. So this brings together again Kolkata and Lagos and Mexico City, but maybe in the discussion, if you like. So here, what is the goal of this kind of entire project? It is to propose new concepts that could contribute towards a new vocabulary of urbanization processes. So the idea behind that is not that we now produce the new vocabulary, but we propose some of the terms. Now on that example, so this example of course are specific examples, large metropolitan territories across the world, but you understand that this new, let's say, concept, or this new vocabulary of urbanization processes should also encompass, of course, processes in peripheral areas, processes in smaller, let's say, urban territories. And so it could become a kind of collective project that at the end we have a kind of a much more diversified, a much more differentiated vocabulary that we can use to analyze and understand our territories. And I mean, our urban territories. And the ultimate goal is, of course, also that we can, with those terms, also maybe inspire, let's say, decision makers, planners, architects, and somehow give attention to processes that usually are completely neglected in all these debates. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.